Looking at what Donald Trump said yesterday, he says that the only threat that he feels right now against the United States is communism.
Mm-hmm.
This is the same sort of rhetoric during, the Soviet Union. The fight between the United States, the capitalists against, the communists in Russia and the Soviet Union. There is no Soviet Union anymore, and there is no, even China is not a communist. They don't recognize themselves as a communist party. They have the Communist Party, but the system in China is that is called it socialism with Chinese characteristics. And socialism is so different from communism. And you see, Europe is, whoever lives in Europe and knows the system in Europe, in Sweden, in Finland, and go in Germany, you see the social sort of policy, socialism, and the policies that support people, the community, the society when it comes to the healthcare and education. These are two important points for the socialists and those people who are supporting the socialist agenda. But it's not anything communist about what's going on. And he's trying to say that what is so important, I don't know if they still see themselves, this hatred toward Russia is coming from this sort of agenda. They're communists. It doesn't matter if we have Vladimir Putin in Russia, the system is not communist anymore, but they're somehow, they feel, the deep down they feel communist. That's against us. That's why we have to hate them, that we have to go against them. That's why we have to continue this war instead of putting an end to this war, even at the expense of, killing all Ukrainians, fighting to the last Ukrainian. As Lindsey Graham said to us over and over, that Ukrainians are fighting this war.
Mm-hmm.
So this is the best investment on the part of Americans. How do you see these two cases, the communism and the hatred toward Russia?
Yeah, I have no explanation. Well, I keep trying to come up with an explanation for the anti-Russian animus. It would be one thing if the government of Russia, since 1991, had embarked on a massive military buildup, that Russia was attacking its neighboring countries and overthrowing the governments, that Russia was involved with building military bases around the world and then using its military power to interfere in the affairs of other countries. But what I've just described is the United States, not Russia. What Russia has become in the wake of with the collapse of the Soviet Union, the Soviet was an oppressive system. There is no doubt, and it was vilified for its attack on Christianity under the Soviets, and religion under a Marxist doctrine was seen as called it the opiate of the masses, is seen as just another way to try to control people. But with the collapse of the Soviets, you had the rebirth of Orthodox Christianity in Russia, and this is not something superficial or artificial. It is profound, and it is widespread. It's sort of it's a miracle that the Orthodox Christians survived during those 70 years of communist rule, that they were not destroyed. There were some that were sent to the Gulag, to prison, but it persevered. So what you have now with once Putin comes into power and immediately poses restraints on the oligarchs who are working hand in glove with Western oligarchs to rape and pillage Russia, he stops that and restores Russia's sovereignty over its own resources. At the same time, Russia's focus from a governmental standpoint is not in terms of making one group supreme over another. I look back in just amazement at from 1999, 1998, with the start of the Second Chechen War, that Russia was facing an unrelenting attack of radical Islamic extremists that were funded by the West, funded by CIA, funded by MI6, supplied, trained, etc., all for the express purpose of trying to destroy, further break up Russia, fragment it so that it was not this massive land that covers 11 time zones, but that it would, the Chechnya would have been separated, and all the different ethnic groups that reside in Russia would be split off. But for 10, 11 years, Russia battled that and defeated it. And during that, there was some brutal fighting. And yet, when you get to the end of it, the Muslim populations, but both in places like Kazan and in Chechnya, they are in Grozny, they are Russian patriots. And I refer to General Abdialadinov, who I was fortunate to meet and become friends with. So, Russia represents a challenge to the West from the standpoint that it has reestablished national identity as its primary organizing principle, predicated upon we'll call them traditional conservative religious values. The belief in God. There is one God. The Christians and Muslims share that. That God created male and female, and that they are to be joined together in marriage. Not this notion that there's transgender and that homosexuality is okay. They stood against that. They weren't tossing homosexuals off the roof. And the Russian attitude has been, what you do in the privacy of your home is your business, but don't bring it into public. We're not going to make that part of our national values. So all of this clashes with the West, which is turned into this culture of degeneracy, is the most polite way I can describe it, where there's still people that celebrate the notion that there's no such thing as male and female, and that you select your gender because of what you want to believe. So that's where I think this conflict is really at. And yet, throughout it, Russia's described as this demonic force. And there's nothing that they can do that convince the West that, hey, in fact, Putin made numerous attempts to join NATO and was rebuffed, first by Bill Clinton, then by George W. Bush. So this is, we're headed towards a confrontation simply because the West will not let it go. They are obsessed with controlling and dominating Russia, and it's ultimately, I believe, they want to be in full control of Russia's resources. It is the number one country in the world in terms of resources, natural resources. And the West can't stand that. They got to have control of it.
I think we have to understand the concept of the military-industrial complex and the role they have in the foreign policy of the United States. Our mutual friend Ray McGovern said Mickey Matt, military-industrial, congressional, media, think tank all together. This is a new sort of phenomenon, and they're so powerful to reshape the foreign policy of the United States. And considering that in the West Asia, I would go region by region. In the West Asia, we have to have a boogeyman, as you call it, Iran,
Yeah.
to sell weapons to GCC countries. You have to have the North Korea to sell weapons to the South Korea. You have to have Russia as an enemy of Europeans to sell weapons to Europeans or to other. This is the policy of that would benefit the military-industrial complex. We may say that the war in Iraq, in Afghanistan, in Libya, in Syria, it was a huge catastrophe strategically for the United States. But you see the role of the military-industrial complex and the way that they're feeding themselves by these wars.
Right.
And I don't know how is that possible for the United States to separate itself or somehow convince this sector of the American economy to find an alternative to make money, to make profit instead of having wars, because this is the recipe for the continuous war. This would feed the Israeli agenda of the endless war in the Middle East, or the European agenda. I'm so disappointed to say that the European agenda in this endless war against Russia, it doesn't mean anything anymore. They have destroyed a country called Ukraine. There is no country called Ukraine today.
Right.
If Russia take Odessa, that's the end of Ukraine, in my opinion.
Well, it was World War II, I believe, that broke the United States, where we suddenly realized, hey, we can be in charge of this. We're the most powerful, and we took it upon ourselves then to try to control the world, remake the world in our image. It is, that it was there that it was really started in 1948 that we started deciding that we could manipulate and control what other countries could do.
Yeah, and when Larry look at Russia today and China, and the way they're, China is far ahead of, I think, all of the militarily, they're far ahead of the United States. I don't know what's your understanding of China militarily and technologically. Technologically, they're far, far ahead of any country on this planet. And here is, before going to your comment, here is what Donald Trump said about China and Russia.
To China and to Russia in space, and now we're leading them by giant steps, and it's a great thing, and it's people like that really, like you, that made it happen. Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Leading China and Russia in space? Is that what he said?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, as long as you ignore the last 25 years, what's happened. So I think it was in 2004 that the United States turned to the Russians and said, hey, can we get a ride back and forth to the space station? Because we don't have rockets that can get us there anymore. And the Russians said, okay. And so that began a period of great cooperation between the U.S. NASA program and the Russian space program. That really should have been the model for U.S.-Russian relations, that, we're working together on space, let's work together on everything else. But no, couldn't do that. Look, China militarily has, I'll call it mass. I mean, they outproduce us on ships, they can outproduce us on anything. But the Chinese aren't warriors. They never have been. They've never been a warrior culture. That was, illustrated back in 1979 when they sent their army into Vietnam to stop Vietnam from attacking Cambodia. And my understanding is the Vietnamese kicked their ass. So China's strength is not its military strength. Yes, it's got great technology. It's not clear that all that technology has been tested in combat and proven to be effective. But in terms of sheer volume, sheer mass, yes, they outdo anybody. However, what what they have become economically, industrially, it's unbelievable. It's the transformation of Chinese society in the last 54 years is something that has never been seen in history. To go from largely an agricultural society with a high degree of illiteracy to the most modern, prolific industrial society in the world. And they continue to make advances that by sheer weight of numbers, the number of Chinese students going to taking engineering courses and STEM graduates, the advances that they've made on a whole variety of fronts, and the United States is desperately trying to maintain some control, but we see the disintegration of our own society internally because of our, basically the rise of degenerate society. So yeah, this is just looking at China it's astonishing. And now China and Russia are in a partnership that is economically remaking the world, and it is changing the economic world that the United States created at the end of World War II, where the United States was the hegemon. Those days are gone. The United States, still the dollar supreme. I'm not saying the United States is unimportant and can cause a lot of mayhem and destruction in the world, but its ability to fully control and dictate outcomes is over.